All right, everybody. I think we're going to go ahead and get started here at 2:02. So like I said, thank you everybody for coming. We are so excited to have so many people here. This has definitely grown since the last time we did this. So yes, thank you for coming and joining us on this Sunday during this webinar aimed at understanding and combating bias within healthcare among Asian American and Pacific Islander communities. This is a community outreach project of Island Liaison. We are an Arizona-based nonprofit organization serving as a resource for the local Pacific Islander community. And it's made possible by the National Asian and Pacific Islander American Chamber of Commerce and Entrepreneurship. Oh, that's a mouthful. We usually just say National ACE. By the way, I wanted to point out that if you registered for our event today through Eventbrite, please keep an eye out after the webinar for a brief follow-up questionnaire for some reporting purposes. Thank you. So before we get to our introductions, I wanted to make a land acknowledgement. So I recognize that I'm coming to you all from O'odham land and the Hohokam who came before them here in Phoenix, Arizona. It's important to acknowledge the original stewards of this land as they continue to fight for equity and land back into Native hands, especially as Pacific Islanders, we can understand that. Please, after this webinar, I invite you to do your own research into whose land that you reside on and how to help in local sovereignty efforts led by Indigenous people. A good place to start is the website native-land.ca. So thank you for that. And now we're going to start with introductions. I'm going to introduce myself and a couple members of Island Liaison, and then we'll get to our presentation. But while I go through introductions, I invite everybody who's here, if you're comfortable, in the chat to introduce yourself as well. Name, pronouns, and then like a fun fact or what brought you here, whatever you want to put. So I'll start. My name is Leo Lubansky. My pronouns are they, them, and I am the community organizer for a local nonprofit called Arizona Asian Americans, Native Hawaiians, and Pacific Islanders for Equity. And I also serve as secretary and social media team member for Island Liaison. So that's me, Taloha. I'm also Samoan, and Samoan's winning in rugby right now, so I needed to say that. We also here have Claudia F. Kircher, aka Auntie Claudia. She is Island Liaison's founder and executive director. Hi, Auntie. We have Jakindi Perez Kosaka. She is a workforce development instructor at Maricopa County Adult Probation. She empowers others through education, and she's a board member and social media team member for Island Liaison as well. Hi, Jakindi. We also have Karen Davis Barr, who is a volunteer for Island Liaison and 31-year magazine publisher who started her journalism career at the Pacific Daily News on Guam. Hi, Karen. And we also definitely big shout out to Kevin Frost, who's our volunteer IT help. He was starting to set up the meeting. Thank you, Kevin. Hi, Kevin. So yeah, definitely I invite everybody as we're going to introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to know who's here and like what brought you here. As that's going, I also wanted to go over a couple of quick procedural items about how the event today is going to go. So Dr. Patricia Wu will present and also do a quick introduction very soon. We will collect questions and discussion items, comments to discuss at the end in the chat. So definitely utilize the chat. We're going to do what we can to capture every comment and question. And at the end, we'll go over everything. Also, this session is being recorded for use by Island Liaison and National ACE. So with all that out of the way, I wanted to turn things over to Dr. Patricia Wu. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Leo, and thank you guys so much for having me give this talk. Let me just go ahead and start my screen share here. Just give me 1 second. Let's see. There we go. Alrighty, can everybody see that? Excellent. All right, so Basically, before we get started, I really just want to say thank you so much to Claudia Kircher and the entire Island Liaison team for putting together this webinar series. I am so excited to give this talk. This is something I'm super passionate about. Shout out to National ACE as well for sponsoring. So this talk is about bias in healthcare. And now, again, we are focusing on Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. So to kind of just get through the idea of like what the talk's going to be about, I'll give a really quick introduction of myself. I do kind of want to get into some numbers about Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders so we can all have a better idea of what our target population is here. And then get into some barriers to healthcare. Now, I realize that we're kind of like, hey, bias, barriers, are they the same? What does that mean? But basically, when Auntie Claudia first approached me to have this talk, my mind was in like a million different places. I was like, oh my goodness, there's so much we could talk about. But really what I wanted to do with this specific talk today is really kind of lay the groundwork, give us a really good foundation of some larger concepts like social determinants of health and structural determinants of health inequities that are affected by bias and that can actually lead to worsening bias specifically within healthcare. So I'd like to kind of use this talk today to lay that groundwork. And if we have the opportunity for another one, that'd be really great, to kind of talk about some more specific instances of bias. So let's get right to it. All right, so basically, like Leah said, my name is Patricia. I am a family medicine doctor, board certified in family medicine. I am proudly Chinese American and Marshallese. My father is from Hong Kong and my mother is from the Marshall Islands by way of Fiji. So I actually grew up in rural Arizona and I graduated from the Ross University School of Medicine in 2017 and completed my 3-year family medicine residency at the University of Arizona in Tucson. And then a little bit after that, I actually joined my father's family medicine practice back in my hometown of Douglas, Arizona. And by this picture that you have here on the right, you can kind of see that family medicine happens to be a congenital issue. My father was a family medicine doctor. I am also a family medicine doctor, and my sister is a doctorate in nursing practice. So she's a DNP who's certified in family practice. And we share this wonderful practice down here in Douglas together. So I just kind of want to give you guys a little bit more information about where I come from. So since we're talking about land, Leo, yes. So this is basically North America. You can kind of zoom in a little bit. We've got Arizona. We've got the entire state of Arizona, but where exactly is Douglas? It's right there. So it's like in this tiny little corner of the state. We are a border town. We are one of 8 sister cities that basically share a sister city across the border in Mexico, along the US-Mexico border. And we're a tiny little town. We're rural. So to put it into context of how close we are to Mexico, the clinic is on 11th Street, and we are 11 blocks from the wall, because the wall does exist for those who are asking. But, practicing border medicine is really kind of this special subsection of even rural medicine. So it's something that's really, really special to me. I chose my residency in Tucson for a lot of different reasons. Number one, it was close to home, but really it had this great focus on rural medicine. And then on top of that, I'd also had this focus on global medicine. And one of the really great things about practicing in Douglas and growing up in this small town is that you get a lot of different people from a lot of walks of life, right? You have this huge transient population that keeps coming and going across this border. And what does that kind of mean for the medicine that we do? I think it changes the medicine that we do. I think it changes the type of physician that I am. But then it really kind of gives that extra push to understand what global health is. So speaking about global health, I was very lucky. The residency that I chose had a global health focus. So I was able to participate in that program. And during my 3rd year of residency, I spent a month down in the Marshall Islands. So this was after, 2 full years of training. It was really great, but I get down there and it was possibly one of the scariest but most exciting things I've probably ever done in my life. You know, I got down there, I thought, oh, hey, I'm still in training, but I was delivering babies unsupervised, and they were in the middle of a dengue pandemic. That wasn't ideal. But, you know, it ended up kind of being that their pediatrician was overworked and really burnt out. So, you know, she ended up kind of quitting after the first week when I was there. So they came to me and they said, hey, you're the closest thing we've got to a pediatrician. I'm like, guys, I'm still in training. And they were like, no, you're going to do fine. I was like, all right, we'll try it. So you can kind of see here on the left picture, that is one of my little babies that had pneumonia. You know, we were fortunate. We had several oxygen tanks that we had available to us. And I was taking care of the regular pediatric ward, the dengue pediatric ward. You know, we had a pediatric ICU. And this picture over here on the right, these kids were really, really, really special to me. They were part of my pediatric ICU. Now, this little girl, she had a congenital heart disease that basically caused a really big whopping cardiac murmur. It was so loud you could hear it across the room. But we were so lucky and so fortunate that we were actually able to get her to the Philippines so that she could have a corrective surgery. And then this little guy, he was my favorite. He was 14 months old. His mother, who was a young lady, it was her first child, she brought him in because he kind of looked like he was wasting away. He wasn't doing well. He was really swollen. And we ended up diagnosing him with something called kwashiorkor, which is really just a protein malnutrition deficiency. But then we ended up finding out that the reason he wasn't absorbing anything is actually because he had TB. So when I was down there, one of the things that I loved about Global Health was that, you know, it was kind of like going home for me, right? Because it's the Marshall Islands. I still have a lot of family that's in the Marshalls, including my grandmother. So if they're watching, Yakwit. But I think that I loved going because it helped me connect a little bit more to my own heritage, but it also helped me live where my patients lived, you know, share that experience that they had, eat the food that they ate, so I could understand a little bit better about how to treat them. And that really is what Global Health is all about. You know, it's not about getting that perfect Instagram photo, you know, virtue signaling about, you know, picturing yourself with all these little sub-Saharan African orphans being like, look at all the good I'm doing. It's more about pushing those boundaries and really kind of forcing yourself into your patient's perspective so you better understand all of their health. But really the point I'm trying to make here is that I got the opportunity to go to the middle of the Pacific, to the Marshall Islands, to go see family and to go live that experience. But you don't have to do that to experience Global Health, right? We experience it here on a daily basis in Douglas. And when we really look at it, we have so much. Sorry, I was going back here. Give me 1 second. But we really have so many people coming into the United States from all different walks of life. So I found this really great website that kind of just shows you click on a country and it shows you where all the immigrants to that country come from. And I just love this photo because I think that here in the United States, you know, we have so many people from all over the place, and it's really great. And it really underscores the fact that, you know, Global Health really is here at home. You know, it's not something that's on foreign soil. All right, so let's get into our numbers. So AAPI, so for those who are not familiar with that phrasing, it is Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. We really are the fastest growing racial group in the United States. It's amazing. We really only make up 6% of the total nation's population, but we're projected to grow to 10% by 2060. And although that was back in 2019, so who knows, it might be even larger now, and it might be sooner that we might be reaching that quota. But let's kind of talk about where we're also coming from. You know, we have 6 main groups that make up 85% of our Asian American population. So you can kind of see here, we have Chinese, Indian, Filipino, Vietnamese, Korean, and Japanese. And so those are the 6 main groups that we have, but, you know, that doesn't mean that's all we are. We actually have this huge other ginormous population that comes to us from a lot of different places. And I love this slide so much because, you know, more than just those main six, we've got over 15 distinct countries of origin that we really come from. And I think it's really amazing to kind of look at this. Now, granted, this is from back in 2012. I wasn't able to get new numbers from the 2020 census, but I thought that this was a really amazing graphic to kind of show how racially diverse we really are. And then talking about our Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islander population as well. So it's kind of funny when you look at the census information, they don't really, they kind of break it down into NHPI and then Asian American. There's never really anything that kind of really brings it all together. But these are numbers from the 2020 census. You know, these are people who identified as Native Hawaiian or Pacific Islander, either alone or in combination. So you can see that our Native Hawaiian population is the largest, just shy of 650,000. And then you kind of have your smaller groups. You have Samoan, Chamorro, Tongan, and then Fijian as well. So that kind of gives us a better idea of like what those numbers look like, right? What kind of what part of the population are we talking about in today's talk when we're talking about what makes it difficult for them to get healthcare? And I want to bring this slide back up because I love just pointing out that, granted, even today we make up only 6% of the total national population, but look at the catchment area for the people that we bring in. Look at how huge that is, right? It takes up almost half of this map. And I love looking at that because even though we make up only 6%, I love to point out that we are geographically, culturally, and racially diverse. All right, so really kind of getting into the meat of this presentation, I'd like to talk about three major areas that are barriers to healthcare for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders. And now I did kind of give the caveat at the beginning that, you know, a lot of these apply to more than just Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, but I did want to lay that groundwork so that we all have a better understanding. Excuse me about that. And so basically we have three major categories. It's implicit bias, social determinants of health, and then structural determinants of health inequities. So to kind of put it into a little bit of a better framework, implicit bias really kind of takes up, when we look at this infographic, that purple and that gold level right at the center of it, right? It's intra and interpersonal. And then when we get to our social determinants of health, that's the institutional and the community level. And then the systemic level is really kind of when we're getting into our structural determinants of health inequity. So this is kind of a framework that I want us to keep in mind when I'm going through some of these. But before we really get started, I'd like to just run us through a thought exercise. I want to take us back to school, okay? I want us to just think about, you know, being back in kindergarten, first grade. You have that fresh new box of crayons, you're really excited. And the teacher comes around and they put this in front of you. And they're like, all right, color in this apple. What color do we color in the apple, right? So unless you grew up next to like a Granny Smith apple orchard, most of us are going to be like, okay, that apple is red, right? You're like, yeah, that makes sense. But when we stop and we really look at it, how many colors of apples do we really have, right? You have green and orange and, you know, multicolored apples. So why is it that we chose red, right? I want us to kind of think about it. Why is it that we chose red? And the answer to that is really implicit bias, right? So implicit bias is basically a form of bias that occurs. It's automatic, it's unintentional, but it affects your judgment, the decisions that you make, the behavior that you exhibit. And one of the things that I really want to point out here is that implicit bias is a learned behavior. It is not innate. Okay, these are learned behaviors. You don't know coming out of the birth canal that the apple is red, right? You learn in school that in order to make that apple recognizable to everybody else around you, the apple has to be red, right? But if you were to hand that to somebody else, the apple has to be red. So that's really kind of a very simplistic form of what implicit bias is. But what we'll basically do is, you know, we're kind of talking about this intra and interpersonal levels. We kind of want to talk about what implicit bias does for ourselves on the inside and what it does to other people when they're dealing with us. So to kind of get into some examples of what implicit bias is against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, The first example that I thought of that was really important to me is that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are seen as a monolith, right? We're kind of just seen as this homogenous category. We just are Asian American and Pacific Islander. There's no breakdown in between. And I pulled up this screenshot from this very famous American cartoon show called King of the Hill. And the main character, his name's Hank Hill. And in this first section, you know, he asks this Asian character whose name is Khan, he says, "So are you Chinese or Japanese?" And Khan goes on this really long-winded but, you know, well thought out answer where he says, "No, I'm actually from Laos. You know, I'm from, it's like a tiny little country that's landlocked between, you know, Vietnam and Thailand." He goes on to tell them information, and they're all just looking at him really confused. And then they ask him again, "So are you Chinese or Japanese?" And it kind of really just kind of underscores the fact that, you know, we're seen as this monolith. We're kind of seen as just those main six, right? You're Korean, you're Japanese, you're Chinese, Fijian, or sorry, not Fijian, Filipino, Indian. And so I just think that it kind of ignores this whole beautiful slide that we had here, where it kind of helped us go into all of the different countries that we really come from. So it ignores that geographical diversity that we really bring to this country. And to kind of really underscore that fact, I loved this picture. It's the language families of Asia. So look at how diverse that map is. But these aren't even languages. These are language families. So think about how many languages and dialects exist within these families, and think about how diverse that really kind of brings it in for people. So it's important that we realize that we are more than just those main six type of Asians, right? That we exist as more than just something than that. The next type of implicit bias that we end up coming up against is that of the perpetual foreigner. We're constantly seen as perpetual foreigners in our own land. And so every single one of these blurbs has been said to me personally. And I think that it's very common for a lot of Asian American and Pacific Islanders to kind of experience the same thing, right? The biggest question, "Oh, but where are you really from?" Right? You know, because they ask me and I say, "Oh, I'm from Arizona." They're like, "No, but where are you really from?" Right? You know, they want to know. And it's, you know, we kind of get into, well, are you asking my ethnicity? You know, what are you asking? But really, when the underlying thought is, I couldn't possibly be from this country, right? You know, they'll tell me things like, "Oh my God, your English is so good." And a lot of people will be like, "Oh, I mean it as a compliment," but it's not, because then the underlying assumption is that English wasn't my first language, right? That whole, and it kind of bleeds into, you don't sound Asian, but I don't know what Asian is supposed to sound like, but why can't I sound as American as you? One of the ones that really kind of hit home for me was during the COVID pandemic. I was acting as an attending physician, the only physician on site for a huge drive-through vaccine clinic in Tucson. And, you know, I had gone to examine this older gentleman sitting in his truck. You know, he was having a little bit of a panic attack. I was able to talk him down from it. It wasn't a reaction to the vaccine. And as I was walking away, he shouted after me, "You should take this virus back to where you came from." And I think that these are the ideas, right? You know, you see Asian people, you see Pacific Islanders, and they don't fit this idea of what people will consider as American. And so that's another form of implicit bias that we're really struggling against, right? As we live here in the United States. Our next form of implicit bias, ooh, this is a fun one, the model minority myth. Okay, so if you ever did any type of Asian Pacific American studies in school or in college, you will definitely know what this is. But for those of you who don't, the model minority myth is basically the idea that Asian Americans are often held up as an example of upward mobility in society. This actually has its history back in, you know, the late 40s, 50s, basically coming in as holding up Asian Americans and saying, "Hey, look at how good they are. Look, they're quiet. They don't make a lot of fuss. They're really, really good at the things that they do, you know, and they don't riot. They don't protest." And so a lot of this kind of came out during the civil rights movement, because Asian Americans were held up as an example against Blacks and Latinos specifically, but almost every other type of minority. And so this is something that it's obviously a myth. We don't like it specifically for that reason, right? Because minorities shouldn't be pitted against each other. But what is exactly the model minority myth, right? I mean, by the time we got into the late 80s, this wonderful Time magazine cover from 1987, where it talks about those Asian American whiz kids, right? It talks about how, you know, they're the ones breaking all the standards for getting into college prep schools in LA County, or, you know, breaking through racial admission quotas at MIT and Harvard. So, you know, we're seen as very smart, we're seen as very technical, and then it kind of leads directly into those Asian career options. You know, what are your options? You're either a doctor, you're a lawyer, you're an engineer. Good Lord, you know, a disgrace to the family if you're not any of those things. And then on the right, I chose this picture of Jeremy Lin. Now, I chose this picture for a lot of different reasons. I love Jeremy Lin. You know, for those of you who don't know who he is a former NBA basketball player who broke and subverted just so many different Asian American stereotypes about being good in athletics. But then he also kind of did it in a way that a lot of Asian parents liked. You know, he did it because he went to Harvard. So that was kind of a lot of things that people were like, oh, hey, you know, he did it the right way. But it's still kind of perpetuating that myth in a lot of different ways. And I kind of just want to point out, while we're here within this model minority myth, there's a lot that still perpetuates today in healthcare. So when you look at Asian Americans, they have a tendency to have lower BMIs. They're seen as smaller in stature, skinnier. Asian diets are often seen to be healthier, a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables. So a lot of times when they go see physicians will be like, oh, it's fine. I don't have to check you for diabetes or high blood pressure. You're not going to have heart disease. When unbeknownst to them, there is a huge incidence of diabetes and heart disease and high blood pressure in Asian Americans that just so commonly go undiagnosed because of this implicit bias that they're just healthier. And it kind of also, again, goes even further where, you know, you have the assumption that Asian Americans are smarter, they're more technical. So physicians have a tendency to use more technical jargon, more medical jargon, without kind of just having a frank, open conversation with their patient, right? Because they make that assumptions about their patients. And the last one that I really want to get into are kind of stereotypes for our Native Hawaiian and Pacific Islanders. So the thing about implicit bias is that really we can kind of colloquially understand it as stereotypes, right? It kind of helps us categorize people. But then on the flip side, it really does that thing where it pushes them all into a single category. So then you never really understand what problems they're coming to you with. But when we think about our Native Hawaiian Pacific Islanders, there's a lot of different things that people will think of. And one of the more common ones is that NHPIs are primitive. They're savage. This is very, very commonly used in Hollywood tropes, right? You know, the costume on the left is actually supposed to be Maui from Moana, so that's The Rock's character. But when you look in Amazon or you search in Google and you say island costume or Polynesian costume, this is kind of the thing that comes up. It's heavily tattooed, it's got a grass skirt, you know, there's no real clothes there. And it kind of just perpetuates that stereotype that, you know, they're really primitive. The other thing that is very common with Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders is that they're fertile breeding grounds for pro football players in the NFL. So our center picture here is Troy Polamalu, who was a very famous Pacific Islander football player for the Pittsburgh Steelers. He's got great hair. So represent, you know, I love that. But I think the thing about it is that, you know, a lot of people will say, oh, you're Samoan, or, oh, you know, you're Tongan, or you're from Hawaii, you guys are big, you know, you got to play football. You know, I recently watched that Monte Teo documentary, and, you know, even he admits, he was like, football was a way for me to financially provide for my family. And so that's another thing that people think of. And then our last picture is on the right. So it's actually two people, but really who I wanted to focus on was the guy on the right. So his name was Yokozuna. That was his stage name. It's kind of a double whammy there, because Yokozuna actually refers to a rank of sumo wrestler in Japan. But basically, Yokozuna was a very famous WWE wrestler, and he was really well known for his fierce and his savage facade. You can kind of see it in his face, right? And so that's kind of the thing. You look at this picture, and if that's people's first introduction to what a Pacific Islander looks like, they're like, oh my God, they're all huge, right? They're obese, they're savage, they're fierce, right? They must be so primitive. And I think, when we look at that, again, that really kind of, again, perpetuates itself into healthcare, where we look at Pacific Islanders and we're like, yeah, all right, oh, you're a PI, okay, you have to get checked for diabetes, or I'm going to treat you like you already have diabetes, when that's not always the case. All right, so moving on to our next section of our barriers to healthcare. Let's talk about social determinants of health. Now, this is something I'm really passionate about. This is something that I learned about when I was in med school. But the reason that I love talking about it is because I really feel like it puts into context how we look at our patients, our employees, our friends, our neighbors, right? It gives us a better idea of what they're going through. So back to this framework, at this point, we're kind of beyond those purple and gold levels. We're in the middle, we're at the institutional level, we're at the community level. So let's talk about what those social determinants of health really mean. Before we get there, I want to ask another question. What is the most important factor that can influence how you live or die? There is a right answer to this, which is actually kind of funny because you wouldn't expect that there would be. As a physician, though, I have a tendency to focus on things that you're doing to yourself, right? Like, are you a smoker? Do you drink too much alcohol? Sometimes we also focus on other things like, do you have a good diet, right? What's the size of your waistline? Are you obese? Are you too skinny? How good is your exercise, right? Are these really important factors, or is it any of these? And the answer is no. These are all still really important factors, but the answer is actually not TV. It's your zip code. So I remember when I first learned that your zip code really is one of the most predictive factors of how you're going to live your life, how healthy you'll be, and how you'll die. It blew my mind. I was like, what are you talking about? What does that mean, right? And it gets us really just into this wonderful concept of our social determinants of health. So in the early 2000s, there was this really, really big push to get medicine outside, beyond the confines of the clinic, beyond the confines of the hospital, to push us outside into our patients' communities to really understand how that has impacted them and what that does to make them come in and see us. So we have 5 major categories here. We have our education, access, and quality, economic stability, community and social context, our neighborhood and our built environment, and then our healthcare access and quality. So to talk about education, access, and quality, why is it important? You're thinking, why does education matter? But really, study after study has shown that people who have a higher quality and higher levels of education actually live longer and healthier lives. So think about the community you grew up in, right? Think about the amount of literacy that was in your community. Were your parents literate? Was your surrounding community literate? What language was spoken in that community? Here in America, we have English as our official language. So were we literate in English? Were we literate enough to get ourselves around in that community using English? What was your access to early childhood education? And then also within your community, did you have access to things like vocational training and higher education? Our next category is economic stability. Of course, this one is really just self-explanatory. What kind of employment is available in the community in which you live? Is it safe employment? Are there certain occupational hazards that are going to put you at risk for certain types of health problems? What's your income, expenses, your debt, specifically medical debt, and what kind of support does your community have in place to help you control that? And then our next one is our community and social context. Social integration. Now, this one's interesting. We talk a lot about racial segregation. We talk a lot about land and what it means to people. Chinatowns really started out as ghettos for Chinese railroad workers, right? It was a way to segregate that community. And even still, we kind of have racial segregation in some of our communities. And naturally, some of it is purposefully done where it's saying, hey, I'm just more comfortable around people of my own, right? But is there any type of animosity, right? Are there support systems within those communities for those racially disparate communities to help support each other? And do those communities care about each other? Do those communities have engagement? Do they want to make their community better? And then let's get directly into our neighborhoods. I love talking about this one because this directly affected one of my patients, right? So we talk about our neighborhood, our physical environment. What kind of housing is available in the area that you live in or where you grew up, right? Are they mainly single family homes? Are they mostly apartments? Are there warehouses? Is it safe? What kind of transportation is available to you? Do you depend on public transportation? Do you have a car? Do you have more than one car, right? Is it safe to walk around? Are there parks and playgrounds in the area where you live? And those are just really important because it kind of actually affects how the patient will be able to even complete some of the instructions that you give them. And last but not least, our fifth category is our healthcare access and quality. Now, this one is really important to me specifically as a rural medicine provider, because in rural medicine, it's really hard to get physicians. And then when you do, they don't like to stick around. So, you know, for me, it's not just about making sure that we have doctors, but we have doctors who care as well, right? And how available are they to you? You know, do they speak the same language that you speak? And if they don't, is there a translator available? Because all of that really ends up affecting the quality of care that you'll receive. But to go back to this framework, I want us to really take a look at it, kind of understand that there's these 5 major things that we're going through. And then to put it all into context, I really want to bring up this map. So there's a professor at the University of Arizona, the School of Geography. His name is Dr. Tong, and he and his team performed this really great assessment and the study of Tucson. So this is a map of Tucson and the surrounding areas, but they did the study of something called a food desert. So a food desert is basically lack of access to a grocery store that has a lot of fresh fruits and vegetables, produce, things like milk, more than just like your local bodega or the local convenience mart that's on the corner. And I want us to really take a look at this map. You can kind of see in the lower left corner here that this is a huge poverty rate, greater than 40%. And you don't see any pink dots in there. Okay, this is the distribution of grocery stores, right? So my clinic, when I was practicing in Tucson, was right kind of in this area. And I think the thing about it is, like, we're looking just at grocery stores, right? Now, let's take a look at distance to grocery stores. So the average distance just to 3 stores. And you can kind of see that you have these concentrations, these pockets of grocery stores that happen here. But then as you just get farther out, they're farther and farther and farther away. And this is just a grocery store, right? This is something that we think, oh, it's really, really simple. But what if I told you that access to medical clinics was actually a very similar pattern of distribution? What if I told you that access to good schools and gyms and safe parks kind of followed that same distribution? That really kind of brings together this framework of how we understand what social determinants of health do. You know, when I was in residency, my clinic was right here. You know, I had a patient who would get onto 3 different buses, and it took her 2 hours to get the 5 miles from where she lived to my clinic. And then when I told her, hey, your diabetes is not well controlled, your blood pressure is not well controlled, you should focus on lowering your sodium, doing more exercise. What did that mean, right? She had to take 2 more bus routes out of her way to then go back home just to go to the grocery store. You know, she depended a lot on donations from the food bank just to make ends meet. And what do they give you? They give you processed foods. They give you canned goods, which are really high in sodium. So those are things that really kind of affect your patient's health that sometimes are just hugely out of their control. And now we can kind of see that with our own implicit bias where we're thinking, no, everybody has access to a grocery store, right? Everybody has access to good schools or walkable parks or, you know, safe play places for their young children. These are things that we can take for granted, and it does create a form of bias for us against our patients not really understanding where they're coming from. So you can see how the social determinants of health really can start to affect our patients. So now to kind of get into our last portion here, we've got our structural determinants of health inequities. So really, again, let's go back to that framework. We're talking about our red circle now. This is our systemic level. We're looking mostly at policies, mostly at laws. So here, this is a WHO framework. Now, granted, this is talking specifically about infant mortality, but we're talking about public policies. This is very much on the macro level, right? How is that affecting our access to healthcare? How is that affecting our patients' access to healthcare, what they can do? And again, this one's talking about maternal mortality, but here I just want to point out laws, right? We're really talking about health and the rights and laws and how that ends up affecting our patients. So I thought about this a lot, and one of the best ways that I felt to demonstrate it for you guys about what structural determinants of health are, I felt was to talk about the history of COFA and the history of the Marshall Islands. So again, as you guys know, I am part Marshallese. And so this is something that's very close to me. This is something that I've grown up with. It's affected family members of mine. So I'm very passionate about this. But to kind of give you guys a better idea of the Marshall Islands, you guys saw on that map that it was kind of in the middle of nowhere, but in 1944, the United States assumed control of the Marshall Islands and the Kiribati as well. So you can kind of see the Marshall Islands here, and then the Gilbert Islands are down here. This is an actual picture from the US military archives that was taken just outside of the Marshall Islands. But Pearl Harbor's here, the Hawaiian Islands are here. You can basically see that it gave the United States really firm footing in the Pacific theater during World War II. So it was massively important for the United States to have access to the Marshall Islands. And so that's exactly why they did it. And then while they were there, you know, they kind of assumed control over the Marshall Islands. But while they were there, they said, you know what, we're going to do some testing because we've got some really great nuclear bombs that we haven't been able to test anywhere else. So between the years of 1946 and 1958, there were several different operations that were carried out specifically about nuclear testing. And basically they did it on two islands. It was Bikini and Eniwetok. And so essentially what they did was they took those people, Bikinians, from their home island, from their ancestral homeland. And if you're Marshallese, you identify with the island that you're from. That land is so important to your internal identity, how you understand yourself. But they were taken from that land and removed and taken to a nearby atoll, or actually it was just a nearby island. It didn't have a lagoon. So they weren't able to do all of the things that they would normally do on their home island. And the United States basically bombed their home island into oblivion, okay? So I bring up a specific test. It was Operation Castle Bravo. So basically, this was March 1st of 1954. This is the actual mushroom cloud of the Castle Bravo testing. Now, most of the time when the United States was doing nuclear testing, the depth charge would go down, and then it would create really super atmospheric levels of radiation, and that would kind of just wash itself out over the entire world. But with this specific bomb, it hit a coral reef. And basically what happened was it then created unforeseen measurements of surface level radiation fallout that then went downwind and actually basically rained radiation onto the Bikinians on this neighboring island that they were on. And they were told, it's for the good of mankind. That is the excuse that they were given, right? There wasn't consent because they didn't know what they could consent to. It was basically human experimentation. And you can kind of see that here, you know, this young child with skin manifestations of radiation poisoning. This picture here was taken 10 days after Castle Bravo testing. You know, repeat medical testing examinations was performed by the United States medical personnel. But one of the things that really happened here was that it actually created persistent health problems in Bikinians and other Marshallese people. There is actually a much higher incidence of thyroid cancer in the Marshallese people than you'll find in other populations. And it specifically has to do with Castle Bravo testing. So during that time, from 1944 and forward, the Marshall Islands was a trust territory of the United States. But in 1986, they ended up signing a compact of free association with the United States. And what that did was that it allowed the Marshall Islands to continue their occupation of Kwajalein Atoll for military purposes. And then it granted the Marshall Islands military protection from the United States. And so there were actually 3 countries. It was the Marshall Islands, the Federated States of Micronesia, and Palau that all signed this Compact of Free Association with the United States. And what that ended up doing was it allowed COFA migrants to actually come and live in the United States as legal or lawful non-citizens, right? You didn't need to seek out gaining a green card or other things like that. You could live here on your Marshallese citizenship and that would be fine. You know,
I think I lost sound, but I'm not sure if
Yeah, I
anybody
think
else.
I think Patricia might have lagged out.
Not yet.
Sorry, bear with us one moment while we figure out this technical difficulty.
can you guys hear me now? I'm sorry, guys.
Yes, you're great now.
Okay, perfect.
It was
You're good to
getting
go.
good.
Okay. Sorry about that, guys. Oh my goodness. Okay. So basically what happened was, you know, you could live here, you could work here, you would pay taxes here, you could join the military even, and, you know, protect the United States and protect your home country. But in 1996, under Medicaid reform, it was a bureaucratic oversight. COFA migrants were left out of Medicaid. So you could be this person who was a functioning and supporting member of society, but you were not allowed to have access to the most basic form of healthcare that this country has to offer. Your families were experimented on, created persistent health problems, including thyroid cancer. And the United States is like, nah, I think that's okay. So obviously I have a lot of kind of deep-seated anger about that. But essentially when we get into it, there is really, really wonderful news. Back in December of 2020, they restored Medicaid for COFA migrants. And honestly, it was thanks to people like Senator Hirono from Hawaii, but also people like Island Liaison and Auntie Claudia, who really championed for this to get done 24 years after a bureaucratic oversight where these people finally given access back to healthcare, right? And I think, you know, to me, I'm like, yes, this is a win. I love it. But this happened in December of 2020. And I want us to think about what happened in 2020. We had the pandemic, right? I just think that that question that I ask here on this slide, was it too little, too late? We had hundreds of Marshallese people die from COVID and no access to Medicaid, to our most basic form of healthcare. And I think that that for me, to rectify the mistake 24 years later is just something that it's kind of unfathomable. It's hard to deal with, but, you know, I think when we stop and we look at it, we have to, you know, I'm still very much proudly American. I'm so glad to live here, but I think that we can't be proud Americans unless we look at both the good and bad sides of our history, because we have to look at that bad side of the history. We have to look at 24 years of not fixing that mistake despite conducting human experimentation on that population. And we have to look at them, we have to say, yeah, you know what, let's not do that again. And so basically for me, it was this really great example of how those structural determinants could actually cause such a huge problem for our Marshallese population. And it really kind of takes us all the way through this framework, right? You know, we're looking at this interpersonal level, this implicit bias against Marshallese people and Pacific Islanders, where they're saying, you know what, they're not going to understand why we do this. Let's just tell them the excuse is it's for the good of mankind, right? You know, they're going to be too primitive to understand why we're doing this, right? Then it takes us to that institutional, the community level about, you know, what did they do, right? They removed them. They kind of offered healthcare, right? And then to the systemic level, where even in the modern day, we're saying, no, you don't have Medicaid. You don't deserve Medicaid. And it takes us 24 years to really fix that mistake. So I think that I love that example so much because it means so much to me personally, but I think it really walks us through how we can see that these structural determinants of health inequities, these social determinants of health, and even just implicit bias really creates all of these barriers for Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders just to getting normal basic healthcare, just to being able to walk into a doctor's office and say, hey, I'd like you to listen to me and see where I'm coming from, right? So in summary, really, thank you guys so much for listening to this talk. I just want to close out by saying, you know, bias really exists in so many different forms. And at the end of the day, it negatively impacts minority and marginalized communities. And so if we have this framework, if we have a deeper understanding about those social determinants, those structural determinants, then we can start to make change. That's when we can start to advocate at a systemic level, right? And on a more personal level, especially speaking as a physician, by focusing on the patient in front of us, you know, we look at them, we understand who they are as a whole person, the history, the culture that they bring with them. We're able to overcome that bias and then really provide the care that they truly need. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia, for your presentation. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you so much. That was amazing.
Thank you.
So yes, everyone in the chat's like, thank you, thank you, thank you. I just want to be cognizant of people's time. It's 2:52, so we're gonna do what we can to keep this space open for questions and comments. If anyone has a question, definitely put it in the chat. I haven't seen any questions so far, just comments. I wanted to shout a couple of comments out in particular. I know that, yeah, Auntie Mercy Hernandez, who she's also with Iowa Liaison, she said, such an informative presentation. We usually only discuss these issues of bias as it relates to diversity in the workplace. This focus on bias in healthcare / medical profession makes me wonder how many cases of medical misdiagnosis have occurred based on personal assumptions.
That's a really great comment. I think, you know, they've actually done studies to talk about the numbers of undiagnosed health problems in Asian American and Pacific Islanders specifically, just because it's been overlooked by physicians based on that implicit bias. I don't have those numbers on me, but yes, they actually have done studies to answer that question, Mercy. It's very interesting that we have those. And I understand that within medicine, you need to have a certain framework, you need to have certain stereotypes about things to make sure that you understand. But I also think that we can see that those stereotypes can start to become harmful.
For sure. There is a question from Dr. Kathy Nakagawa. Thank you for asking, Kathy. Does physician training cover a NHPI bias?
Wonderful question, Dr. Nakagawa. No. You know, this is, I will say that obviously, you know, there's actually not a ton of discrimination or racial bias training in medical school, which is just something that is unfortunate. They kind of just leave it to, you know, they leave it to like interest groups in medical schools and stuff to do talks like that. But this is something that I've personally been really passionate about. This is something that just very much affects me. It's affected my practice. It's affected the type of physician that I am. And I think it's always really important for us to kind of have that outreach, you know, to talk about it. And we had several different talks about social determinants of health and other things like that when I was in residency training. But I did a lot of this research just on my own.
Yeah, I had a feeling you were going to say no. But yeah, no, it's good to know officially that that's not, yeah. And it's frustrating that you had to do that on your own, but we're glad you did. We're all glad you did.
Thank you.
Let's see. Oh my gosh, there's things coming. Michael John said, Trisha, your presentation was fantastic. I so want Tanner to hear this. I'll need to find out how to get a recording to him. Well done. I'm grateful you and your family are my healthcare providers.
Yay. Hi, Sally. So Tanner, I actually grew up with him, and he is actually a wonderful physician in his own right, completing his training in family medicine and psychiatry out in San Diego. So I'm sure that he'd be such a wonderful asset to this community as well.
Yay. Let's see. So I also wanted to shout out that Karen Barr in the chat said that we will be posting this recording of the webinar to YouTube, and we'll send the link to everybody who attended for sharing purposes. Just, yeah, lots of great presentation. Thank you so much, Dr. Wu. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Exceptional presentation. Okay, and then Auntie Mercy did follow up and say, this is one of the best webinars we have offered. This should definitely be presented in other arenas for those in med school. I feel the passion extend beyond the professional parameters. Thank you. So right now it's a lot of comments, a lot of thanks, which of course we're all grateful for because you did an amazing job.
Yeah.
Again, I'm just being cognizant of time. It's 2:56. Does anybody else have any questions for Dr. Wu?
I just want to say thank you again for just giving me the platform to get that out there. Thank you guys so much for your time and for listening. In Marshallese, como baba.
Leo, this is Auntie Claudia.
Yes, Auntie.
And Dr. Wu, now I just love calling you doctors. I've called everybody doctors, and I can call your whole family doctors, the Wu doctors, and Dr. Tech as well. Let's not forget him. Thank you, everyone. This could not have happened. This is one of the greatest things, and I share Dr. Wu's sentiments because I too was a child in the Marshall Islands. And I was very happy when Dr. Wu was our intern, and she helped me understand a lot more, and her family. And so we'll be producing and bringing more information about our islanders on how to continue to help our islanders. I want to thank all of you. In fact, here's the information regarding the December 4 that we are having. Oh, there's an admission. Okay. To there.
Yes, and I can.
We're down there. Yeah. And just como tara. Thank you. Sizusmasi. Kinisho. Kamagar. Kalangang. Thank you to everyone. And to Island Liaison's Board of Directors, and to the Wu family, and to everyone. I saw that we apologize for the slight glitch. And we had Dr. or Judge Roxanne Sang-Ong on. Thank you. Thank you, everyone. And to Kevin and to everyone. And we look forward to having more of this type. And please let us know if you would like to have more webinars in what subjects that we are knowledgeable about in our expert and how we are helping our islanders. Thank you.
Thank you, Auntie. I did want to, just go back to the slide with the FQ Story Historic Home Tour and Holiday Marketplace, because I don't see any more questions. We're going to be there Sunday, December 4th. We're going to have takeaway food, crafts, talk story. All the information is there. It's on West Linwood, a block south of McDowell Road from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. So we hope you guys can come to that. And then, of course, on the other slide that Kevin had, the contact us slide, if anyone has any other questions, follow-ups for later, you guys can contact us on our website, email, Facebook, Instagram. We're trying to be everywhere. And yeah, so I think I'll call it. It's 3 o'clock right now.
Leo,
Yeah.
I just wanted to point out, Dr. Nakagawa is wanting to remind us that admission to that event is free. The $20 to $25 is for the historic marketplace tour, I believe. So
Gotcha.
just, yes. So even though that says that admission, and it might be for a table maybe as well, or something like that, but admission is free, but you do want to bring your money so that you can buy some of those candy crafts that we'll have available for you.
Yeah, definitely. No, thank you for pointing that out, Dr. Nakagawa. Thank you. Yeah, that's pretty much, well, that's all I have at least. Thank you everybody again in Samoa and Paftailawa for joining us today. We hope that we left you guys with a lot of insight and perspectives that you guys can carry into larger conversations. And just thank you all so much. I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of your Sunday. Thank you.